A millionaire completely consumed by his business empire had practically abandoned his role as a father, leaving all those responsibilities to his new wife. Then came that day when he noticed his little daughter trembling with fever, small and large crimson spots covering her entire face. That was the wake-up call that made him rush her to the hospital. And when the doctor delivered the grim diagnosis, all he could do was collapse. Tears of deep remorse streaming down his face for everything his little girl had endured. So settle in and join us as we dive into this tale. I hope it motivates you, makes you feel good, awakens your empathy, and maybe even gives you that gentle push you need to sleep like a log tonight. If you're watching this story unfold right now, drop a comment and tell me, what would you do if you discovered you've been blind to your child's suffering? Would you have the courage to change everything? Let's begin. It was the morning after Richard Harrington's wedding, and the white mansion on the quiet street of Sunset Boulevard seemed to have undergone a total renovation. From the curtains and floral arrangements to the rugs, everything bore the stamp of the new woman. Valerie Harrington, the second wife of the real estate mogul, stepped out of the master bedroom, claiming the space with the bearing of a true boss. She paused by the enormous glass door, gazing at the dew-covered front lawn, her blonde hair falling softly over her shoulders, her eyes as still as a calm lake. There wasn't a trace left of the late wife, nor of that feeling of a home once filled with children's giggles. Downstairs, Emma sat in the corner of the dining table, her small hands clutching a slice of cold toast. She was 7 years old, brown hair, slender, and so quiet you might not notice her if you weren't paying close attention. She used to be the center of her dad's universe until that universe started spinning in another direction. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. Every morning, Emma still hoped her dad would come down for breakfast with her. But today, sitting beside her was the new lady of the house, not her mom. Valerie sat at the head of the table, sipping her tea, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on the child. "Aren't you going to greet your mother?" The words were soft, but they were enough to thicken the air. Emma shrank, whispered, "Yes, ma'am," and bowed her head. Richard, seated nearby, gave his daughter a distracted smile. "Say hello to your mom. We're a family now." He thought that was enough. Then he went back to scrolling through the news on his phone, not noticing at all how his daughter was trying to disappear. When breakfast ended, Richard rushed out for his first meeting of the week. As soon as the car doors shut, the mansion fell silent. Valerie stood in the middle of the dining room, looking around as if taking inventory. After a few seconds, she began opening cabinets, pulling out old storybooks, a little dress Emma used to wear, the doll her mother had left her, gathering them all into a single box. "Old things only remind us of sad things," she declared, her tone as flat as if she were throwing out garbage. Emma stood near the door, hands clenched tight, too scared to speak. She watched her belongings disappear, her lips moving, but all that came out was a tiny whispered, "Okay." Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. The house changed hour by hour. In the living room walls, family photos were replaced with abstract art. In Richard's bedroom, Valerie removed every picture of his late wife, a woman she never knew but seemed to know very well. From the pile of photos, she lingered longest on one, the woman holding Emma in a lavender garden, eyes full of tenderness. Valerie stared for a long while, then turned the photo face down. That afternoon, Emma was meticulously reorganizing her toys in the living room. Valerie walked by, glanced over and said, "You missed the dust in that corner. You need to learn to keep things tidy." The little girl shrank, trying to follow the instruction, her hands trembling slightly. Valerie stood behind her, watching every move like a warden. Under the afternoon light, the image of an impeccable woman emerged, her dress perfectly pressed, a dusting cloth in hand, her lips curved in a slight smile. But that smile didn't reach her eyes. If you were Emma's teacher and noticed something was wrong, would you speak up? Let me know in the comments. That night, Richard called home to check in. Valerie held the phone, her voice smooth. Emma's being very good, helping with chores. I just want her to learn a little discipline. On the other end, Richard let out a soft chuckle, completely at ease. He didn't hear the faint clink of a spoon against a bowl, the small sound coming from the dining table where Emma sat completely alone. When Richard returned, dinner was ready. Valerie had outdone herself: roast beef, wine, candles. He walked in, a bit surprised, but his heart felt warm. I've never seen our home look so cozy, he said. Valerie smiled, meeting him with a tender look. Across the table, Emma kept her head down, cutting her meat into small pieces, eating a few bites, then setting down her fork. No one asked why she'd stopped eating. After dinner, Richard went upstairs to his home office. Valerie cleared the table, then headed to Emma's room. The little girl was searching for her doll, the only thing she had left from her mother. Valerie stood in the doorway, holding the object. Old things have to go. You're a big girl now, she declared. Then she turned and left. Emma stood frozen, fists clenched, biting her lip hard to keep from sobbing. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment about this story and rate it from 1 to 10. How are you feeling? If there's anything you'd like to share, I'm always here to listen. I hope you find a moment of peace and reflection as you follow this healing story and its journey of courage and justice. As night fell, the enormous house was silent. Richard was sound asleep after a long day. Emma lay restless in her room, blanket pulled up to her chin. Outside in the hallway, Valerie's slow footsteps echoed regularly. She poured herself another glass of wine, walked past each room, and stopped at the child's door. Light filtered through the crack, catching Emma's eyes still open. The child turned toward the wall, pretending to sleep. Valerie opened the door silently, standing motionless. On the opposite wall hung a small photo that remained of the ex-wife, one Richard had forgotten to remove. In the picture, the woman smiled, holding her daughter, her gaze full of tenderness. Valerie approached, her finger lightly grazing the frame. A flash crossed her face, half reflection, half annoyance. Then her hand tightened its grip. She removed the photo from the wall, placing it face down on the table by the window. The wind slipped through the window crack, and the image trembled slightly, reflecting the figures of two women, one in the photo, another standing there, just inches apart but miles away in their gaze. Valerie watched for a moment longer, then left, allowing the room to sink back into shadow. Emma remained perfectly still, not daring to turn around, only listening to the soft click of the door closing. Can you imagine being 7 years old and feeling this alone? Hit that like button if this story is touching your heart. The next morning when Richard came down, Valerie already had breakfast ready. The house was tidy, almost sterile. Emma took her seat at the table, her eyes searching for the familiar corner on the wall where her mother's photo used to hang. Now just an empty space. She lowered her head, nibbling on her cold toast. Richard didn't notice the change. He simply complimented the great breakfast and told his wife, "I'm a lucky man to have you." Valerie smiled, glancing at the silent Emma. All day, Richard was tied up in meetings, and Valerie continued with her adjustments. She called a team to change the curtains, changed the paint color in the living room, and added a fresh vase of roses to the dining table. The house was like a blank canvas, every trace belonging to the previous woman systematically erased. At noon, Emma silently carried her toys to the back corner of the yard, where a large tree provided shade. She sat there, hugging her knees, quietly watching the new house she no longer recognized. What would you tell Emma if you could? Share your thoughts below. When the sun began to set, Richard returned, seeing the impeccable arranged home, and smiled with satisfaction. Valerie came out to greet him, her eyes soft. Saying Emma had been helping all day. Emma stepped aside, watching the two adults talk, her face completely expressionless. That night, the lights were still on in the mansion. Richard was working in his office. Valerie was reading a magazine. Emma sat in the darkness, looking out the window at the garden. In her mind were old images, her mother's laughter, her mother's hand brushing her hair, the faint scent of lavender in the breeze. She closed her eyes, trying to remember that voice. But everything was gradually fading. A week after Valerie officially moved in, the atmosphere in the Harrington mansion had completely changed. From early morning, the sound of cabinets opening, chairs scraping, and the click-clack of high heels echoed through the hallways. Valerie appeared with a black-covered notebook in hand, filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. She placed the notebook in the center of the dining table where everyone could easily see it. It was labeled family schedule, meal times, cleaning times, lights out time, all organized like a corporate calendar. Richard reviewed it and smiled with approval. He said the house had long needed a woman's touch to restore order. Valerie just nodded slightly, her eyes directed at Emma, as if checking the child's reaction. Do you think structure is love, or is love something else entirely? Tell me what you think. Emma sat quietly, hands in her lap, avoiding eye contact. From that day on, Emma had her own assigned tasks: cleaning tables, folding laundry, making beds, polishing glass doors. Everything written clearly on a paper stuck to the refrigerator. Children should learn to work from an early age, Valerie declared. Richard heard this and thought it was good for his daughter. He'd always believed discipline builds character. Once Richard left the house, Valerie began her morning inspection of each room. She called Emma downstairs and showed her how to clean the dining table, how to hold the cloth evenly. When Emma went slow, Valerie didn't yell, she just watched intently until the nervous child started over again. There were no harsh words, only a silence that made one feel small. Emma tried to work faster, but her small hands weren't used to this. A glass of water accidentally tipped over, spilling across the table. Valerie gently took the cloth from the child's hand and cleaned it herself. Valerie didn't speak, but her look was enough to let the child know she'd made a mistake. Have you ever felt judged without a single word being spoken? Drop a comment if you relate. When Richard called that afternoon, Valerie said over the phone, "Everything's fine, honey. I'm teaching Emma to be self-sufficient." Richard let out a small laugh of relief. He didn't know that at that very moment, Emma was sitting curled in the corner of the kitchen, looking at her hands roughened by dish soap. By late afternoon, the front door opened. Mrs. Helen, the former housekeeper, stopped by for a visit. She'd been with the family for years, caring for Emma since she was a baby. When she saw Valerie open the door, she smiled warmly, about to greet her. But Valerie stepped out and politely informed her that her services were no longer needed. "The family has enough help now," she declared. Helen looked over Valerie's shoulder, saw Emma standing behind her, then quickly crouched down, pulled a small bag of cookies from her pocket, placed it in the child's hand, and gave her a soft pat on the head. "I have to go now. Be a good girl." When Helen's figure disappeared beyond the gate, Emma opened the bag, ready to take a bite. Valerie walked past, saw it, picked up the bag and dropped it in the trash can. "Stale cookies aren't good for you." The little girl fell silent, her lips trembling slightly, her eyes downcast. If you could send Emma a message right now, what would you say? Comment below. She needs to know she's not alone. By the end of the afternoon, the house filled with the smell of food. Richard returned, taking off his jacket, noticing how everything gleamed. Valerie came out to meet him, telling him how Emma had learned to mop floors and help tidy up. Richard was pleased. He walked over and patted his daughter on the head. "That's great, sweetheart. Daddy's proud of you." Emma looked up, forced a smile, then stepped back. When Richard went upstairs to his office, Valerie followed, placing a hand on his shoulder, mentioning that Emma was a bit clumsy and had spilled water. But she was patiently teaching her because the child needed boundaries. Richard looked up, met his new wife's eyes, and simply nodded. He trusted that his wife knew more about raising children than anyone. The next morning, Emma was awakened earlier than usual. The clock had just struck 6 when Valerie's voice echoed through the hallway. "You need to develop the habit of not being dependent." Emma rubbed her eyes and got out of bed. On her desk was a new task list: mop the floor, fold laundry, polish the stair railing. The little girl took the paper, read each line, nodded, and began her chores. Does anyone else feel exhausted just hearing about Emma's morning? Let me know you're watching. While Emma was bent over mopping, Valerie walked by, stopped, took the child's hand, and pulled the mop across the floor hard. This is how you clean properly. She let go, leaving a red mark on Emma's skin, then turned and left. Emma watched her go, her hand trembling, but she kept mopping. At midday, the sun shone through the kitchen window. Richard called home. "How are my girls?" he asked cheerfully. Valerie responded dryly. "We're fine, honey. Just teaching Emma to be self-sufficient." Richard smiled, sounding relieved. He didn't know that at that very moment, Emma was sitting in the corner of the kitchen, hugging her knees, sweat dampening her forehead. By afternoon, Valerie was busy making phone calls, organizing a small party. She wanted to meet the neighbors and invite some old friends. Richard thought it was a great idea, saying it was a perfect opportunity to introduce his wife to everyone. Valeria smiled, looking at Emma, saying the child should participate to learn proper manners. "Would you attend a party if you knew a child was being mistreated in that house?" Hard question, I know. That night, the house was packed with people. Guests arrived, all praising how clean and beautiful the house looked. Emma ran back and forth, serving drinks and collecting plates. One guest turned and commented, "She's a sweet child." Valerie let out a light laugh and responded, "She needs a lot of training to be this well-behaved." Richard was nearby, heard this, and felt even more satisfied. He raised his glass for a toast, convinced he'd found the woman who could put everything in order. The party stretched into the late hours. When guests left, Emma was still meticulously picking up glasses and plates. Valerie stood by the stairs and said quietly, "You did well tonight. Finish cleaning the tables and chairs, then you can rest." The little girl nodded, continuing her work silently. Outside, Richard was saying goodbye to the last guests. The sound of conversation faded, and car lights disappeared. Inside, Valerie turned and walked through the living room. Emma had fallen asleep in the chair, her small hands still gripping the cleaning cloth. Valerie stopped for a moment, looking at the child. The overhead light reflected on Emma's face, pale and exhausted. Valerie reached out and turned off the light switch. The room sank into darkness. The night wind slipped through the window, bringing with it the faint streetlight that dimly lit one side of Emma's face. On her cheek, a faint reddish streak had just begun to appear. If this scene doesn't break your heart, I don't know what will. Please hit subscribe. Stories like this need to be told. The next morning, weak sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating Emma's face. Valerie opened the bedroom door and entered, her eyes fixed on the child's cheekbone. The reddish streak from the night before was now more distinct, extending toward her temple. Valerie tilted her head, looked closely, then said softly, "It's nothing. Your skin is just sensitive." Emma sat up, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, and whispered, "It feels rough." Valerie smiled, pulled a wet wipe from her pocket, handed it to the child, and told her to rub hard to soften the skin. Emma obeyed, tears mixing with sweat, as they rolled down her face. By midday, Richard came home early unexpectedly. A meeting had been canceled. The house was silent, only the sound of water running in the kitchen. He walked in and found Emma sitting at the table, her cheeks flushed, her hair stuck to her sweaty forehead. Richard frowned. "What's wrong with you?" Valerie came out of the inner room, holding a medicine jar, and quickly responded, "Just a mild case of chickenpox. I've already put some cream on her." Do you think Richard actually believed that? Or did he just want to? Let me know in the comments. Richard nodded, relieved, accepting her explanation, and poured himself a glass of water. "Don't worry," Valerie added. "Kids have good immune systems." He gave a small smile and didn't look at his daughter again. As the afternoon wore on, Emma was tired and had a low fever. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Valerie still assigned her tasks. "Go reorganize the bookshelf. Moving around will help you feel better." Emma nodded, trying to stand, her hands trembling. She managed to put each book back on the shelf, her back damp with sweat. Richard was in his office then, on a call about a new investment venture. His laughter echoed through the house, drowning out the faint horse cough coming from outside. When night arrived, Valerie served an elegant dinner, candles lit, wine poured, dishes meticulously arranged. Richard talked about his work while eating, and Valerie chimed in with her plan to open her own fashion center. "I support you," he said, raising his glass for a toast. Emma sat beside them, staring at her rice, unable to swallow. Valerie glanced over. "Aren't you going to eat?" Emma shook her head and responded quietly, "I'm not hungry." Valerie smiled, turned away, and acted as if she hadn't heard. Have you ever been ignored when you needed help the most? Share your story below. After dinner, Valerie called Emma to clear the table. The little girl was carrying the tray and accidentally dropped a spoon. The metallic clink on the floor was faint, but in that silence, it sounded like a bell ringing. Valerie didn't speak, she just watched. That look was colder than any scolding. Emma lowered her head, picked up the spoon. Her small shoulders hunched. Richard remained seated there, scrolling through the news, paying no attention. Late into the night, the house was silent. Emma lay in her room, the fever rising, her breathing rapid, her body shaking. Valerie opened the door, stood staring, her eyes scanning the crimson mark on her cheek that had spread to her neck. She pulled out her phone, the screen light reflecting on her cold face. Without saying a word, she closed the door and went downstairs. Richard was asleep in the adjacent room, resting deeply after a long day. The next morning, the mark had darkened, crawling down her neck. Emma was coughing, her voice hoarse. Valerie opened the door, mixed a glass of water, and placed it in front of her daughter. "Drink this, then get to work so you feel better." Emma nodded, drank it all, and picked up the floor mop as usual, her hands trembling but forcing herself to continue. Afraid of being seen as weak. By mid-morning, the temporary cleaning lady arrived, a middle-aged woman hired for a few hours daily. She saw Emma hunched over, her face bright red, and asked, "What's wrong with the child?" Valerie turned, the smile disappearing from her lips. "Don't meddle in family matters." Her voice was short and sharp, making the cleaning lady immediately shut up. She only managed to set down the trash bag before leaving silently. If you saw a child suffering like this, would you speak up or stay silent? Be honest in the comments. That afternoon, Valerie opened the door to two old friends. The scent of perfume filled the room. Emma stood near the door, slightly bowing her head to greet them. One guest looked at the child and joked, "Is she allergic to something?" Valerie laughed lightly, responding, "Just a kid who sneaks snacks, I suppose." The group laughed and continued their conversation. Emma stood still, her hands tightly clenched, trying not to touch her burning cheek. When the guests left, Emma sank into a chair, exhausted. Valerie called out, "Richard's calling, asking how you are." Valerie answered sweetly, "She's resting. Don't worry." He laughed, saying he'd be home late due to a meeting with a partner. Valerie hung up, sighed, then grabbed her coat, preparing to go out. She looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep slumped in the chair, a cold gleam in her eyes. It was getting dark. Rain began to fall, and the wind whistled through a slightly open window. Emma was sunk in a feverish sleep, her breathing shallow. The house was dim, the clock ticking constantly. Valerie's footsteps echoed lightly, then stopped at the bedroom door. She closed it silently, turned and pulled her phone from her purse. "Are you here already?" Her voice was soft with a hint of laughter. The murmured conversation drifted from the living room, mixing with the sound of rain outside. Emma woke with a start, sweat soaking her pillow. The crimson mark on her cheek glowed in the dim light. She tried to sit up, looking around the empty room. No one was there. Outside, Valerie's laughter still rang out, blending with the rain. Emma whispered for her daddy, but her voice was too weak to reach him. Can you imagine calling for help and no one hearing you? Hit like if this is devastating to watch unfold. She crawled to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside lay the garden strip where she and her mother used to play, now just dry branches. Emma's breath fogged the glass, faded and disappeared. Downstairs, glasses clinked, wine poured, and shoes scraped the floor. Valerie was talking, her voice cheerful. Richard was still at the office, reviewing reports. Completely unaware, Emma went back to bed, lay down and tried to close her eyes. The fever made her head spin. The sound of the rain felt distant. Her hand searched for her old doll but found only empty space. In the middle of the night, Emma's temperature spiked. She vaguely heard someone's footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of a car door closing. All that remained in her head was a buzzing, a noise like the wind. The house sank into darkness, with only the streetlight filtering through the window, shining on the child's face. Upstairs, Richard stirred in his sleep, completely unaware that just below him, his little daughter was shivering between the cold air and a relentless fever. And so there she lay, eyes slightly open, staring at the door, the place where no one walked through. Before we go further, tell me, do you think Richard deserves what's coming? Comment your thoughts. A blanket of fog covered the backyard. Humid air filtered through every crack in the doors. Valerie was in the kitchen, pouring a cup full of coffee, then directing her gaze toward the staircase. The strange stillness made her frown slightly. Upstairs, she opened Emma's door. The room was small, still retaining the smell of the cream applied the night before. In the bed, Emma lay curled up, her face ashen, her forehead drenched in sweat. Valerie leaned in, touched the child's forehead, and felt the burning heat transfer to her fingertips. Valerie paused for a few seconds, then withdrew her hand. She pulled back the curtain, opened the window, letting the cold wind rush in. The humid air quickly chilled the blanket. Emma shrank, let out a soft moan, her lips trembling. Valerie glanced over, said nothing, simply closed the door and went back downstairs. In the kitchen, the temporary cleaning lady had arrived. She saw how weak Emma looked and showed concern. The child is sick. She needs rest. Valerie turned, her voice firm without needing to raise it. She needs to learn to be strong. Kids should be tougher than that. The woman fell silent, her eyes uncomfortable, still holding the cleaning cloth, slowly bowing her head to continue her work. Would you have spoken up? Or would fear have kept you quiet? Let me know. Near noon. The phone rang. Richard called to check in. How are my girls? He asked cheerfully. Valerie smiled, her voice calm. Emma's just a little tired. Don't worry, I already gave her some medicine. On the other end, Richard heard this and felt reassured. He looked at his watch. An important meeting awaited him. Valerie's voice was so smooth that he believed everything was under control. Time passed slowly. Emma's fever didn't drop, it climbed. The little girl was thirsty, trying to sit up to find her cup. But the bedroom door had been locked since morning. She crawled to the door, leaning her back against the wall. Her breathing heavy. Downstairs, music was playing. Valerie was busy preparing for a small gathering with friends. As the afternoon faded, the crystal chandelier cast golden light throughout the living room. Guests arrived, laughter and chatter filling the air. Glasses clinked. Emma, upstairs, heard the sounds faintly. She tried to sit up, but her head spun. She collapsed beside the door, her breathing irregular. One guest accidentally spotted Emma on the stairs and stopped dead. What's wrong with her? Valerie turned, giving a brief smile. Just pretending to be sick for attention. Then she raised her wine glass and continued. The guest hesitated. Looked back once more, then stayed silent. If someone told you a child was just pretending, would you believe them? Drop a comment. The party ended at nightfall. Red wine stained the floor in streaks. Glasses and plates were scattered everywhere. Valerie walked past without looking down, simply adjusting her dress strap. She went upstairs to the bathroom, leaving Emma curled in the hallway, her face flushed under the yellow light. Outside, the wind picked up. Then the rain began to fall. Inside, Emma woke in a daze, her whole body drenched in sweat. Her hand crawled along the cold wall to try to sit up, then fell back again. The house was now filled only with the sound of rain drumming against the window glass. interspersed with the faint, struggling breaths of the 7-year-old fighting the fever. Near midnight, a lightning flash shot through the window, shaking the curtains. Valerie lay in her room, holding her phone, her soft laughter echoing in the darkness. The man's voice on the other end made her smile widen. Outside, Emma jolted awake, softly calling, "Daddy!" But no sound came out. The fever clouded her vision, and the room spun. A bolt of lightning struck nearby, and the house electricity flickered. The doorbell rang. Valerie frowned, grabbed her robe, and went downstairs. It was the electrician, scheduled to fix the fuse box. He was waiting outside the door, his raincoat still dripping water. When he entered, his flashlight beam swept the staircase and froze. Emma was slumped there, her hair disheveled, her face dark red, her lips dry and cracked. He set down his tools, knelt, checked her breathing. His hand touching her burning skin, Valerie quickly approached, frowning. "Don't worry. She just has a cold." The electrician looked at her, unconvinced. He pulled out his phone, took a photo, and quickly sent a message to a friend who was a pediatrician at the city hospital. Urgent review needed. Small child. High fever. Red-purple face. Valerie watched him work, a look of annoyance crossing her face. "Just finish your job. I can take care of the child." The electrician said nothing, just nodded. He fixed the fuse box and left. But before stepping out the door, his eyes turned back. The image of the motionless child under the dim light was burned into his mind. That electrician might have just saved Emma's life. Have you ever been that person who noticed when no one else did? When Richard finally arrived home, the clock read past 10 at night. The house was strangely quiet, no music, no lights, no laughter. He called his daughter's name, only to hear a faint echo. Walking into the living room, he saw Emma lying on the couch. Her small body curled up, her face burning red. Her breathing labored. Valerie stood nearby, arms crossed, saying briefly, "She just has a cold. I called the nurse." Richard leaned in, putting his hand on her forehead. Her skin was scorching, her pulse so weak he had to put his ear close to hear her shallow breathing. He stood abruptly. "This isn't right. We need to take her to the hospital." Valerie interrupted. "You're overreacting. It's just a fever." He looked at her, his eyes wavering, but then turned back to his daughter, her blue lips, red skin, barely closed eyes. An instinctive alarm went off. Without another word, he lifted her up. Her small body felt light as a feather, her breath as faint as smoke. Valerie stood still, neither stopping him nor speaking. Richard ran to the door, opened the car, placed her in the back seat, and started the engine. Outside, heavy rain fell. The headlights cut through the white curtain of water. Valerie stood in the doorway, the house light illuminating her emotionless face. When the car pulled out of the driveway, she turned and closed the door. The house returned to silence. She walked straight to the liquor cabinet, grabbed a new bottle of wine, and poured a full glass. As she raised the glass to her lips, the phone on the table vibrated. The screen showed another man's name. Valerie looked at it, smiled, and sat on the couch. Her gaze fixed on the window where the car's taillights had just disappeared into the rain. Do you think Valerie ever loved Richard? Or was it always about the money? Tell me what you think. Outside, the storm hadn't finished. The rain seemed to continuously beat the window glass. Inside the house, only one woman sat in the golden light, holding a wine glass, taking slow sips, her eyes empty. The wail of the ambulance siren faded as Richard carried his daughter directly into the emergency room. His shirt was soaked, his hair stuck to his forehead, his breathing frantic. Nurses rushed over, pulled out a gurney, laid Emma down, and quickly wheeled her through the emergency doors. Richard stayed behind in the hallway, his hands clenched until his knuckles were white, his eyes glued to the crack in the closed door. Time seemed to distort. He heard the sounds of machinery, the movement of doctors' and nurses' shoes, and concise orders echoing from inside. A doctor came out, asking him to sign papers authorizing a comprehensive examination. Richard signed quickly, his handwriting shaky. 2 hours later, the results were ready. The doctor on duty, who'd been on call that night, held the file, his voice heavy. Your daughter has Sturge-Weber syndrome, a congenital vascular disorder affecting the brain, eyes, and skin. She needs immediate surgical intervention. Richard heard every word, but his mind was spinning as if someone had thrown ice water over his consciousness. He could only ask, "Will she be okay?" The doctor paused, then said, "We'll do our very best. But the child is very weak." Richard staggered back, leaning against the wall. In his mind, images from the past days replayed, the first crimson mark, his daughter's faint complaint, Valerie's indifferent smile, and his own silence. Have you ever realized too late that you missed all the warning signs? Sheriff, this hits close to home. He remembered every moment he'd overlooked. Every evening he'd only glanced at his daughter before returning to work, through the glass panel of the operating room. Emma now lay motionless, her face deeply flushed, her lips dry, her breathing shallow. Richard placed his hand on the cold glass, feeling helplessness flood through him. He whispered, though no one could hear, "I'm here now, my baby girl." The surgery began. Needles, lights, the rhythmic sound of machines. In the hallway, Richard sat motionless. 8 hours crawled by, suffocatingly slow. He didn't eat or drink, his eyes never leaving the door. When the surgeon finally emerged, he removed his mask and nodded slightly. Richard collapsed in a chair, tears bursting forth uncontrollably. At home, Valerie turned up the music. She was on the phone with a journalist, discussing her plan to launch a fashion line. Her laughter rang out constantly. Outside, the wedding photo on the wall reflected the wine light, hanging slightly crooked. No text message was sent to Richard. Not a single word of inquiry. If you're feeling angry right now, you're not alone. Let me know in the comments. The next morning, Emma woke, her eyes barely open, blurry, looking around. Richard sat beside the bed holding her hand, saying some choked words. Emma nodded slightly, and her eyelids closed again. He leaned in, his forehead touching the back of her hand. For the first time in years, Richard cried not from failure, but from fear of losing the only real thing he had left in his life. The doctor approached, quietly discussing the long-term treatment plan. Richard nodded, asking to learn all the care procedures. He practiced clumsily changing bandages, learning to clean his daughter's face with a damp cotton ball. His hands shaking so much he dropped a water bottle. A nurse came to help, but he shook his head. He wanted to do it himself. They exchanged glances, understanding this was a father trying to make amends through the smallest tasks. On the 4th day, Valerie appeared. The hospital room door opened, and the scent of perfume flooded in. She wore a red dress, carrying a large bouquet, accompanied by 2 reporters. "Just came to take some memory photos," she said. Richard looked up. Cameras flashed incessantly. Valerie stood beside the bed, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder, offering a perfect smile for the photo. Richard remained silent, his eyes empty. When everyone left, he simply bowed his head silently and walked out to the hallway without looking back. In the room, Valerie adjusted her dress, checking her reflection on her phone. Her lips curved slightly when she saw how many people had liked the photo she'd just posted. Millionaire Richard Harrington's devoted wife by his side. The caption appeared on the bright screen. "Can you believe someone would use a sick child for social media? Comment if this makes you sick." In the following days, Richard received a treatment cost bill several pages long. He looked at his sleeping daughter, then opened his laptop and sent a request to sell stocks. When his assistant called to ask, he simply said, "I need time." He handed over all his work, putting his phone on silent mode. Valerie seemed annoyed. During a rare visit, she insisted, "You're ruining your career over a temporary illness." Richard didn't respond. He was cleaning his daughter's forehead, then changing the bandage. His movements slow but sure. Valerie turned, her eyes cold, leaving the room before he could look up. In the days that followed, her visits became less frequent. When she appeared, she always carried designer bags and extravagant coats. The strong perfume masked the smell of antiseptic. She only looked at Emma for a few seconds. Then checked her reflection in the wall mirror, adjusted her hair, and uttered a few words about how life had to go on. One afternoon, Richard had to leave to arrange new treatment procedures. When he returned to Emma's bedside, it was unchanged, but the chair beside it was empty. On the side table lay a carefully folded note. "Honey, you need to think about the future. I can't live in this hospital forever." Richard read the last line, remaining motionless for a long time. There was no sound, only the constant beeping of his daughter's heart monitor. He took the note, crushing it tightly in his hand. Veins stood out on his wrist. Then his hand suddenly went slack. The paper fell to the floor, the sound as faint as a broken breath. He sat beside the bed, watching his daughter sleep. Emma's face was less red but still fragile. Her small hands moved slightly, searching for warmth. Richard placed his hand over hers, holding it gently. The heat transferred through her fragile skin, but it was so real he couldn't pull away. Outside, the sky darkened. The hallway lamplight shone through the window, illuminating the two hands tightly gripped together. Richard said nothing, just watching his daughter. His eyes were marked by fatigue, but something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work, wealth, or anyone else. Just the girl lying there, the girl he'd so negligently abandoned. If you've ever had a wake-up call that changed everything, share your story below. You're not alone. In the following days, Richard never left the hospital. He moved permanently into Emma's room, asking the doctor for permission to stay and care for her. The folding chair in the corner became his bed, his jacket his blanket. Every morning he prepared warm water and cleaned his daughter. Every 2 hours he changed the cloth, checked her temperature, touched her forehead, and counted each shallow breath. The doctor showed him how to change bandages, how to clean the skin after laser treatment. Richard took meticulous notes, the letters sprawling across the small notebook. The hands that once signed contracts were now clumsy opening rolls of gauze. Once he dropped a bottle of disinfectant, spilling liquid everywhere. A nurse rushed to help, but Richard just bent to pick it up, saying quietly, "Let me do it. I have to get used to this." Emma's fever returned a few times. Each time she was in a feverish state. All he could do was place his hand on her forehead, listen to her weak pulse, and wait for each tiny breath. The doctor said the little girl was a little warrior, possessing rare strength. Richard nodded but didn't respond. He understood that in this story, he was the one who had to learn to fight against his own indifference, against the man he used to be. Drop a heart emoji if you believe people can change. I'm reading every comment. Meanwhile, Valerie gradually disappeared from the father and daughter's life. She came once, picked up some belongings, saying she needed time to rest. The grand mansion on the hill was now filled only with the sound of the new housekeeper's broom and bucket. The living room window stood slightly ajar, curtains drawn. The once luxurious house now felt cold as stone. Online, photos of a radiant Valerie with another man went viral. She smiled brilliantly at a party, her wine glass glittering under camera flashes. A news outlet published the headline, "Millionaire Harrington's young wife finds new happiness." Friends called to ask, but Richard didn't answer. He simply turned off his phone and returned to the damp cloth, gently wiping his daughter's face. One morning, Emma woke after her first laser treatment session. Her whole face was swollen and red, her eyes barely open. Richard showed her a small mirror. Emma looked at herself for a long time. Her face was distorted by deep crimson marks. She didn't cry. She just lightly touched the affected area and set down the mirror. Richard wanted to say something but couldn't. He knew his daughter was braver than any adult. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment about this story and rate it from 1 to 10. How are you feeling? If there's anything you'd like to share, I'm always here to listen. A few days later, Valerie returned. She wore sunglasses, a designer dress, and entered the room with a large purse. She placed a thick envelope on the table. She said briefly, "This is my share of the assets. Please keep it." Richard stood silently, opened a drawer, and pulled out a settlement check. When he placed it in her hand, their eyes met. There was no resentment, just two strangers completing a transaction. Valerie took it and turned. The sound of her high heels struck the cold floor constantly, echoing down the hallway. When the door closed, the smell of expensive perfume lingered in the air. But coldness had completely reclaimed the room. Richard sat in the chair, his hands slack, his gaze empty. In his mind, he reviewed the years past, the long flights, the dinners with only the clinking of silverware. The times Emma waited outside his office door and he never looked up. Those images cut deeper than any accusation. Have you ever looked back and realized you wasted precious time? Tell me about it. That night he opened his laptop and searched for old photos. On the screen appeared a picture of Emma at 3 years old, hugging her mother's neck in the lavender garden. Richard looked for a long time, his finger touching the screen. He remembered the first morning after his wife's funeral, when Emma ran into the room calling Daddy, and he'd simply turned away in silence. All those moments crashed at once, an undeniable reminder. The next morning, Richard called the chief physician. "I want to stay during the entire treatment process," he said, his voice resolute. No one objected. From that day on, Richard officially registered as a volunteer in the ward. He helped nurses push beds, take children to x-rays, change sheets and wash food trays. People at the hospital were surprised. A millionaire who once had everything was now doing menial tasks in silence. But Richard only responded, "I want to learn how to stay." Emma slowly recovered. The long therapy sessions exhausted her, but when she opened her eyes, she always saw her father nearby. Richard read stories, talked about people who'd overcome illness and about the strength of hope. She listened carefully, sometimes giving a faint smile. Those first smiles after months of silence warmed his chest. If this doesn't restore your faith in redemption, nothing will. Hit that subscribe button. One afternoon, sunlight filtered through the window, shining on two intertwined hands, one large and rough, one tiny and covered with needle marks. Richard felt the warmth transfer through her skin, a simple feeling he'd forgotten for far too long. When night fell, he sat silently beside the bed. The constant beeping of the heart monitor was a rhythmic reminder of life. Outside, the city was still bustling, cars still moving. But in that small white room, there were only two people, a girl learning to stand up, and a father learning to be a father again. Richard bowed his head gently, placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder and whispered, "I won't go anywhere ever again." Emma didn't respond, just turned slightly, her small hand softly touching his arm. Many weeks later, the hospital room door opened, and natural light touched Emma's face for the first time. The doctor said she could go home, but long-term therapy had to continue. Richard nodded, signed the file, and personally folded the small blanket she'd slept with every night. As they left the hospital, he carried a small bag of belongings and a prescription list, several pages long, thin papers that marked a new chapter in their lives. Can you feel the hope building? Let me know in the comments if you're rooting for them. In the car, Richard drove silently, and Emma rested her head on his shoulder. Outside, the late afternoon was cool, the sun slicing through trees, casting a weak, fleeting light. Richard glimpsed his daughter briefly in the rearview mirror. Her cheeks still bore crimson marks, but her eyes had life again. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, the silence was striking. The house that used to be brightly lit every night was now immersed in dim light. Valerie was gone, leaving only expensive decorations and a cold emptiness. Richard opened the door, standing in the threshold for a long time. The place once filled with parties was now filled only with the sound of the wind whispering through curtains. He helped his daughter inside, one step at a time. Emma looked around, lightly touching the old armchair where she was once forbidden to sit. The familiar scent of perfume remained, mixed with the smell of wood and dust. Richard saw a glimpse of sadness in his daughter's eyes. So he turned and began collecting all items related to Valerie: picture frames, coats, the decorative vases. Each item was carried to the basement, the door closing softly, as if ending a long period. How many of you are celebrating this moment? Comment below. That afternoon, the new housekeeper arrived, Mrs. Helen, over 60, with a kind face and soft voice. She knew a bit about their situation, so she kept a respectful distance, only asking when necessary and remaining silent when she should. The house now contained only 3 people: a fragile girl, a father learning to start again, and a woman who knew when to be quiet. On their first night home, Richard cooked dinner. He awkwardly battled with the soup pot, spilled it, and a faint burnt smell rose. Emma sat at the table, watching her father struggle, and gave a slight smile. The laugh was small, but enough to make Richard look up. He smiled back, clumsily cleaning the pot, saying, "Next time will be better." The little girl nodded, a spark of light returning to her eyes after months of darkness. As night fell, Richard wrote out his daughter's medication schedule and stuck it on the wall. On the new desk, he placed a small clock to time doses. Everything in the room was now perfectly organized, with no trace of the past. In the corner of the closet, the old doll he'd found in the box of old things in the basement was put back in its place. When Emma saw it, her eyes lit up. Richard simply said, "Your mom used to keep it here. Is anyone else crying right now?" "Just me. Let me know." The next morning, the physical therapist came for a checkup. Emma had to practice walking with a walker. Her legs trembled, each step a challenge. Richard walked behind her, gently supporting, saying very softly, "It's okay. Just one step at a time." Emma tried hard, sweat beading on her forehead. But she didn't give up. The therapist smiled, saying the little girl had a rare spirit. Richard watched his daughter, understanding that strength was born from pain she shouldn't have had to endure. In the following days, Mrs. Helen began planting some clusters of lavender in the garden. "Children need something beautiful to look at every day," she said while turning the soil. Emma stood nearby, squinting under the sun, her small hand holding the watering can. The subtle scent of lavender spread throughout the garden, touching Richard's memories of his late wife. Of those golden afternoons when Emma used to run in her little sandals. Richard slowly returned to work, but didn't leave the house. He set up his office desk near the window where he could look at the garden. Every time he looked up from the screen, he saw his daughter practicing walking. Her steps slow but determined. Sometimes he simply stopped, watching silently, the scene a painting that was both peaceful and moving. If you're feeling hopeful for the first time in this story, let me know with a comment. One afternoon, Emma walked a bit farther than usual. The practice walker slid slightly, tilting left. Richard ran over, catching her. They both fell onto the grass. The ground was soft, and the scent of lavender surrounded them. Emma laughed, and Richard stayed still, then began to laugh too. The laughter echoed in the air, light as the wind. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt truly alive. That night, he prepared warm milk for his daughter, placing it on her small table. Emma lay in bed, her hair spread out, her breathing even. The desk lamp shone on her face, where the crimson birthmark remained, but it was no longer frightening. Richard gently placed his hand on her forehead, feeling an unusual peace. He realized that some things can never be erased, but one can learn to love them anyway. In the attic, he opened the window. The night wind rushed in, carrying the scent of freshly bloomed lavender. Below, the small bushes showed a purple hue, like a memory coming back to life. Richard stood still, eyes slightly closed, listening to the wind through the window frame. He no longer felt the emptiness from before, only gratitude for the opportunity he still had. The phone rang. It was the doctor calling to inform him that the next laser treatment session would be more difficult and might leave scars. Richard fell silent, looking toward his daughter's slightly ajar door. From inside, the soft yellow light cast a long bright stripe on the floor. He placed the phone on the table and sat silently. His hand closed, then relaxed. The light from his daughter's room shone through the door crack, illuminating his thoughtful face. In that light, worry, hope, and love seemed to blend into one, not loud, not full of promises, just a father sitting and watching over his child's sleep, waiting for the next dawn. "Are you ready for what happens next? Stay with me, we're almost there." The treatment day arrived again, and Richard woke very early that morning. He prepared the medication bag, a coat, and Emma's favorite wool scarf. When he carried her to the car, the morning sun was still weak, shining on the trees lining the street. They both entered silently into the city's medical center, where sterile white hallways and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the distant aroma of coffee. The doctor explained the new treatment procedure, meticulous in every detail. Richard listened, nodding, his heart heavy but his eyes determined. When he signed the consent form, his finger trembled slightly. Yet he didn't hesitate. In the waiting room, plastic chairs lined up neatly. Richard sat among other parents, each with the same look of fatigue, weak but persistent hope burning inside. The man beside him, about 30, spoke of his son who had a congenital heart condition and needed multiple operations. Richard didn't say much, just nodded and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. In that handshake, they found common ground in their shared fear. The fear of losing the child they loved most. If you're a parent watching this, you understand. Drop a comment if this hits home. The treatment room door opened, and a nurse called Emma's name. Richard leaned in and said quietly, "Daddy will wait right here." Emma nodded slightly, her small hand squeezing his, then letting go. She followed the nurse, her steps slow, her body thin, her old blue dress swaying softly. When the door closed, Richard collapsed in the chair. His hands gripped tightly until they were white. The laser machine hummed constantly inside, mixing with the faint smell of medicine and heated skin. He closed his eyes. Each sound resonating from within felt like a cut in his mind. Old images overlapped: Valerie's cold laughter, telling Emma she was annoying, telling him not to spoil her too much. Richard gritted his teeth, his chest tightening. When the door opened, Emma came out. Her face was swollen and red, but her gaze was calm. She didn't cry, just looked at her father. Richard stood, walked quickly toward her, and lifted her up. He didn't ask, "Does it hurt?" He just held her tight, enough for Emma to feel her father's heartbeat. The entire ride home, they didn't speak. The car drove silently, with only the constant hum of the motor and the slow breathing of the child resting on her father's shoulder. At home, Mrs. Helen had prepared warm water and a story. The room was softly lit by a golden lamp, unusually cozy. Richard laid his daughter down, took a cloth soaked in water, and gently wiped the crimson streaks around her cheeks. Emma winced. He paused and blew softly on the area, a small gesture that made the child smile. "It's better now," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse. "This is what real love looks like." Share if you agree. In the following days, Richard regularly took his daughter to treatments. Each time, he meticulously recorded notes in his notebook, crossing off each task: which medication, when to take it, when to apply cream. He learned to read medical instructions, even how to distinguish between types of medical tape. Mrs. Helen often joked, saying she rarely saw a father so careful. Richard just smiled, saying, "If I'd been this meticulous before, my daughter might not have been in so much pain." Emma began to talk more. She spoke about the lavender garden, about the sweet aroma every morning, and her plan to plant some new pots. "I want white ones too," she said. Richard nodded, promising to find that variety. In the mornings, father and daughter went to the garden together. Emma practiced walking, and Richard followed, adjusting her walker. Sometimes they stopped, drawing together on paper placed on the stone bench. Emma drew flowers, and Richard drew the house. The clumsy sketches intertwined, forming an image that was imperfect but full of life. One day, the physical therapist suggested Emma should have more social interaction to improve her reflexes. "She needs school," he advised. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He sat by the table, looking out the window. The lavender garden was blurry in the mist. He was afraid his daughter would be treated differently. Afraid people's eyes would fix on her crimson mark with cruel curiosity. But then he understood. She needed to grow. She needed to know the world wasn't just pain. Would you be brave enough to let your child face the world after everything? Tell me in the comments. A few days later, Richard went to a nearby private school with a program for children with special needs. He spoke with the principal, explaining Emma's condition in detail, his voice low but full of determination. When everything was arranged, he returned home, hugging his daughter for a long time. "Tomorrow you're going to school. Daddy will go with you," he said. On the first morning, Emma wore her school uniform and carried a small backpack. The birthmark was still visible, but her eyes were brighter than ever. As they walked through the gate, many people stared, and some children whispered. Richard walked beside her, holding her hand, walking slowly, not avoiding anyone. At the classroom door, he knelt, tying her shoelaces, and whispered, "Go in. Daddy will be right outside." Emma nodded and went in. In the afternoon when school ended, Emma came running out, holding a piece of drawing paper. "Look, Daddy." On it was a drawing of two people, one tall, one small, standing in the middle of a purple flower garden. Richard took it, his heart constricting. The child had drawn the father figure large, his hand raised, shielding her from the sun. He looked at it, smiling through teary eyes. "It's beautiful," he said. Then he folded it carefully and kept it in his wallet. If this scene doesn't make you believe in second chances, nothing will. Subscribe if you're with me. That night, the house felt warm. Richard cooked dinner himself. Emma helped set the table. They both laughed about how salty the soup was, but still ate it all. After dinner, Richard read her stories, his voice even and slow. Emma lay on her side, resting her head on his arm, falling asleep before he finished reading. As night descended, Richard went to the garden, sitting beside the lavender bushes. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the sweet fragrance. He looked up at the sky, at the few stars breaking through the clouds. He no longer thought about incomplete deals or long meetings. He only saw that he'd changed, a simple father learning to love again through small actions. From inside the house, Emma stirred, softly calling Daddy in her sleep. Richard turned his head. Her bedroom light shone through the window, falling on his face. He stood, walked toward the door, stopped at the threshold, and looked inside where the warm golden light illuminated the small bed where the child slept peacefully. His shadow merged with the doorframe, blending with the night outside. And in that quiet moment, Richard realized some things are lost forever. But some things, when we're brave enough to love again, become a new light. What does this story mean to you? I want to hear your thoughts. Comment below. Time passed, gentle and incredibly tender. Every 2 months, Richard took Emma to the treatment center. The little girl got used to the smell of disinfectant, the constant hum of the laser machine, and the harsh white lights. After each session, Emma's face was red and slightly swollen, but her eyes remained bright. She often said, "Today we got a new star." From that small joke, Richard created the Bridge of Light game. After each treatment, he cut out a golden star and stuck it on her bedroom wall. Each star represented a moment when Emma overcame pain. At first, there were just a few small ones, but soon the white wall was covered with brilliant patches of light. Emma called it the bridge leading to sunrise. One night while sticking a new star, Emma tilted her head, smiled, and said, "When the bridge is finished, we'll go to the beach, Daddy." Richard nodded, gently touching her hair. Absolutely. He kept that promise deep in his heart like something sacred. If you're rooting for them to reach the beach, let me know in the comments. The house gradually changed with the rhythm of the father and daughter's recovery. The living room, once cold, now had a new bookshelf. On the dining table, there were always fresh flowers. Mrs. Helen still came every morning, teaching Emma how to bake, measure flour, beat eggs. Richard at first only watched, but then also learned to mix dough. Clumsy but patient, the three of them created a warm rhythm of life, simple, quiet, and complete. His old job called. A partner company invited Richard back as CEO with a salary he'd once only dreamed of, but this time he declined. He only agreed to be an external consultant, setting his own flexible hours. While signing the final email, he looked at his daughter's desk where Emma was drawing, her shoulder gently curved. He knew he'd made the right decision. Friends were surprised. Some called him to meetings. Others advised him not to lose his position. Richard just laughed. I once had the whole world but lost my daughter. Now I only need this world to be smaller, but with her in it. One morning, the doctor called, reporting routine test results. His voice was low but gentle. The condition is excellent. The birthmark will gradually fade, and there will be no more complications. Richard fell silent for a few seconds, then responded quietly, "Thank you," when he hung up. He looked at the garden where Emma was watering the flowers. That simple scene warmed his heart like sun after a storm. Can you feel the transformation? Comment if this journey has touched your heart. That afternoon, father and daughter went together to the garden to cut grass. Richard held the scissors. Emma held the watering can. Sweat dampened their shirts. The child splashed water everywhere, soaking her father's shirt. He pretended seriousness. She laughed, and then they both burst into laughter. The laughter echoed beyond the fence, mixing with the sweet scent of lavender, giving the house a living breath. That night, after tidying up, Richard told his daughter about his childhood, the boy who loved to draw, who dreamed of being an artist. But then I chose business because I thought I had to make a lot of money to be respected. Emma listened, her eyes wide, her voice small. Do you regret it? Richard paused, then smiled. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have you now. The next day, he bought drawing paper and colored pencils, placing them in the corner of the study. This is your creative corner. Emma cheered, running to open each box of colors. Every day, she drew a different picture, sometimes the lavender garden, sometimes her father's hands, sometimes the small kitchen with a smiling Mrs. Helen. Richard sometimes sat beside her, picking up a brush to try drawing, adding some clumsy strokes. The patches of color gradually filled the wall, continuing the bridge of light through the room. This is what healing looks like. Share if you believe in the power of love. One afternoon, Emma's art teacher stopped by. After looking at the drawings, she smiled and said, "She has wonderful emotional depth. You should let her participate in the children's exhibition." Richard was surprised, but seeing the excitement in his daughter's eyes, he nodded. They selected the best drawings, carefully framing them. Richard treated each small task as a ritual, cleaning the glass frame, applying the label, writing his daughter's name neatly. The night before the exhibition, Emma still sat at the table, carefully coloring the details of the largest painting, two hands intertwined in the lavender garden. The desk lamp shone on her face, her eyes bright and focused. Richard stood in the doorway, not daring to interrupt, just watching. He saw in every stroke the long journey, the sleepless nights, the pain she endured, the tears he once couldn't see. Now everything had transformed into color. When she fell asleep, Richard stuck the very last star on the wall. The bridge of light was now complete. Under the warm light, hundreds of golden stars reflected, shining like a glittering river in the night sky. He touched it, his heart full of mixed feelings, pride, relief, and gratitude. Early the next morning, Richard called a car service, carefully placing the framed drawings in the trunk. Emma put on her coat, grabbing her sketchbook, her cheeks naturally pink. As she walked toward the porch, the first light of day poured into the garden, reflecting through the window glass, illuminating the room where the wall full of stars shone as if they were real. Richard opened the car door, bowing his head to let his daughter enter first. Emma turned and smiled. "Remember your promise, Daddy. After hanging my painting, we're going to the beach." He smiled, gently stroking her hair. "I remember." The car door closed, the engine starting. Richard looked toward the high, calm blue sky. The sun's rays cut through the clouds, shining on the roof of the house where the bridge of light in the small room seemed to extend outward, arching across the sky, leading the father and daughter to a new day where the past was left behind, and the future began with that gentle light. And that's the bedtime story for tonight. A long journey of love, redemption, and learning to be a father. A once distant and cold man, Richard, gradually reclaimed his heart through the smile and eyes of his little daughter. And you? After hearing this story, how do you feel? Which character resonated most with you? Was it Richard, the father who went through so much internal turmoil to earn his daughter's peace? Or Emma, the strong child, gentle but tough as lavender flowers in the wind? And throughout the journey, what action moved you most? Was it when Richard carried his daughter out of the cold house in the rain? Or when he stuck the final star on the bridge of light, a symbol of unwavering faith and affection? Don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below so we can talk more about this story. Who knows, somewhere in Richard and Emma's journey, you might find a small piece of yourself. The soft part. The part that was loved. And the part that learned to love again. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Thank you for being here. Good night, and may you sleep peacefully.